I think it was the passion and the love of the game of climbing. But it was Leo's idea. He said, look, you really should, when you're 80, let's go and do the Old Man of Hoy. And I thought, yeah, brilliant idea. And I was very, very tense leading up to it.
It's not the most pleasant day today, but, it's a wild corner of the British Isles, and hopefully, this isn't too bad. When the rain turns on, that's a bit unpleasant, but we're definitely in for an adventure, and if we can all get up there tomorrow, that's going to be a very memorable day.
And I've never thought really of doing anything less dangerous, less difficult. The person though with the drive has to have a strong ego as well, and what causes that ego, coming from the kind of probably a very emotionally unstable background, whatever it is, that drive was there. And I was certainly ambitious. In some ways I had quite a lonely childhood, and one was always felt one was different. Single mums back in the 1930s were unusual. I felt the loss of a father. He came back after the war. He was a physically courageous man, and he was unreliable, and so he'd arranged to come and pick me up and take me out, and he'd never turn up. I think all of these things actually go to feed the kind of person you're going to be. The key thing, I think, with how individuals respond to the challenges of life, if you like. My uncle was a professional photographer, and his assistant had done a bit of climbing, and it was he that took me down to Harrison's. I loved it passionately from that very first moment. But of course, didn't remotely imagine that I could make a career around climbing. Early January 1953, when I decided to leave school, I was waiting to go do my national service. And I was climbing with a guy called John Hammond, who was a good climber. He was one of the Harrison Rocks climbers, but he was a good alpinist, member of the Climbers Club. So I slowly and gently came into that climbing community. And I suppose my first brush with really good climbers was when John and I were going to have, in fact, my first brush of winter climbing. It was some trepidation, actually, coming into this climbing hut, belonging to the Junior Mountaineering Club of Scotland. Thank God. I remember the very first moment that Hamish McInnes walked into Llangarve, into the hut. He had a commanding presence and a kind of raw-boned. He tended to, not in a domineering kind of way, but he certainly was the central figure and the driving force of almost any group.
I was looking for somebody to climb with. You get an instinct, that you've got a fellow enthusiast.
It was only later, really, that I gathered just how important a kind of figure Hamish McInnes already was. So this were serious climbing for me, or serious mountaineering for me, actually started. And of course, just round the corner there's the Buckle. Oh, it's a magnificent mountain. Hamish came into my life and got me onto the really hard stuff. So to be plunged straight into winter climbing with one of the finest climbers that Scotland had at that time, I just learnt an immense amount. And he was an incredibly important mentor for me. Hi there.
Good
really good to see you. It really is.
Yeah.
You're looking good.
I feel great.
I think the thing with Hamish was that he had boundless kind of imagination of what he could do. And we went on to doing the Crowberry Ridge Direct, which is a summer VS.
I think was probably our most dangerous climb, climbing in stocking feet to adhere to the ice. And one of the trouble with climbing in stocking feet, your feet tend to slide out of the socks. The socks stay there, but you start to move down. It's quite alarming, you know.
We went off to try to climb Raven's Gully, which was the current last great problem of Glencoe. Well, you were climbing, I remember, standing under a bloody waterfall.
Well, at that particular picture, we were under the waterfall. There was a kind of rising ramp, very smooth, and that's known as the bicycle pitch. So it's called the bicycle pitch because there's nothing for your feet to grip on. Your feet are scrabbling like that, and you're holding on to this.
We established, I think, a friendship and a respect for each other. And it meant that a few years later, when I'd gone through Sandhurst, I hadn't been a terribly successful army officer. My organisation levels in the army were not good. I was actually stationed in Germany, first time I'd ever gone abroad, and I could actually get down to the Alps to go climbing. And I wrote to Hamish and said, look, how about, can we meet up and go climbing in the Alps together? And I got a postcard very promptly back saying, yes, sure, he'd love to climb with me. And how about meeting me in Grindelwald, and our first objective would be the north wall of the Eiger, which is, and I kind of thought, oh yeah, that's a good thing, good way of starting. I just looked at it, bloody hell. and I thought, this is not something I should be doing.
And I was worried that you were going to kind of mutiny before we got anywhere near it.
The first 1,000 foot of the north wall of the Eiger is just scree and scrambly rock to the foot of the difficult crags, and you bivouac there. And you're kind of stirring the tea with an ice piton. I was downright terrified.
And then this ominous cloud came in.
A fiery sunset, and I said, look, Hamish, I think the weather's changing. That's a front. I think we should get down tonight. I think I was incredibly lucky with what in effect were the mentors. My climbing relationship with Hamish McInnes that actually took me to a level very fast that I couldn't possibly have reached without him. And then actually the start of a climbing partnership with Don Mullins, and that was even stronger. Don was, I think he's the finest mountaineer I've ever climbed with. I saw an advert, a local advert, an internal advert for an instructor at the Army Outward Bound School that had just been formed, and so I immediately applied for that, and my colonel said it was a very bad move. I got my first Himalayan expedition out of that, which was the Combined Services Expedition in 1960 to Annapurna 2. I wasn't captivated by it, and yet at the same time, it was, Annapurna 2 particularly, it was, a beautiful peak. It's only a few metres below 8,000 metres. And we got to the top of it, and I took a very active part in it. But it wasn't my main passion at that stage. And I think I just couldn't wait to get back to the Alps. And I was then invited to go to this expedition on Nuptse, which was a civilian expedition, and the army saying that I couldn't because they wouldn't give me leave, and me deciding to, yes, I'd get out of the army to go on it, but at the same time not having the confidence to think I could make a living around climbing. 61 was actually one of the really formative periods of my life. I'd got the promise of a job with Unilever as a management trainee, and I was going to join them in September of 1961. I mean, it was basically 9 months focused completely on mountaineering. So this was going to be my climbing swan song. We got to the foot of Nuptse and started looking at it, and of course it was unclimbed, and it was the third peak of Everest, very, very nearly 8,000 metres. Dennis Davis and myself, as the most experienced climbers, were actually pushing the route out. I think we took a quiet dislike to each other almost from the word go. He was wonderfully organised, and I'm not terribly well organised, and certainly as a tent companion I must have been horrendous. But there were so many arguments and disagreements. Somehow that climb, to me, I think I almost want to just put it away out of my mind. We actually had a fight at 7,300 metres when Les Brown got into fisticuffs with our expedition doctor, Jim Swallow. And the final push, and there were 4 of us at the top camp, there wasn't a bit of food on the entire mountain. We were completely on our own, but we succeeded, we did it. But you're looking straight across the western combe to Everest and the southwest face. And, I suppose I should have thought, gosh, what a fantastic thing to go for. I wasn't remotely interested in Everest. I mean, after all, it had been climbed, for heaven's sake. And so it was an amazingly successful expedition that had been not at all happy. And yet somehow we'd succeeded. And yet I don't think anyone had real satisfaction from it, because we'd just got on so badly together. Of course, at the end of all that, we had to drive all the way back, and I joined them in these 2 little hillmans which were beginning to show signs of stress already. And then I was dropped off at Chamonix to meet up with Don Willans. At that time, in 1961, my focus was definitely the Alps. We both wanted to go for the North Wall of the Eiger. It was personal ambition to be the first Briton up it. And so it was the mystery of that, the excitement of that, the challenge of that really filled my horizon to the exclusion of anything else. And we hitchhiked across to Grindelwald. Neither of us had much money at all. We were living on potatoes. The weather was consistently bad. And then we spent the rest of the summer still sitting below the North Wall of the Eiger.
And then finally, though, to try to save the season, we decided, well, let's go to Chamonix and try to climb something decent. On the way, that's Don, that's me, we'd collected Jean Duclos, who was a Polish climber who'd also been waiting to try to climb the North Wall of the Eiger. We needed a 4th person, and so this character here, Ian Clough, who was a young Yorkshire climber whom we didn't know, but we'd heard really good things about. So we invited him to join us to attempt the central pillar of Fresnay, which is a rock pillar, a rock tower, high on the south side of Mont Blanc.
Europe's leading mountaineers attempted this, including Walter Bonatti. Ran into a storm below the Chandelle, the crux of the climb. A massive epic descent where 3 or 4 leading European mountaineers lost their lives.
So it had a really awesome reputation. The serious thing about the central pillar of Fresnay, it must be the most remote and most difficult of access of pretty well any of the routes in the Alps.
And to get at it, you've actually got to do a major climb. We were doing it from the Col de la Fourche bivouac hut here, and you had to go across here, climb the couloir de Perthuis, which is very, very long.
It must have been it was an incredibly brave thing to do. It was certainly the highest, and still remains the highest bit of technical rock in the Alps, and so in Europe, being so close to the summit of Mont Blanc, and possibly at the time in the world. I don't know. It's immensely difficult climbing for the time.
By golly, did one feel lonely up there, knowing, what the previous party had gone through. So we set out, and I mean, it was pure coincidence that there were there's Maison Poulet Villard and Pierre Julien with huge rucksacks going onto the very same téléphérique. I'm never quite sure that I'm right about this, but whether he just couldn't bear the thought of us going for it. The top of the Chandelle, it kind of slightly overhangs all the way around, and then Don led this absolutely incredible pitch. It was an overhanging nose. So Don went in, he managed to get one peg in, and I think it was about 20 feet below the overhang. And then the overhang was breached by an undercut chimney. He had got his shoulders actually jammed into the chimney. He was just hanging there, and inevitably, he was going to fall off eventually. At last, I kind of shouted down, "I'm coming off, Chris," and then there was a long pause, and then he fell off, and he came hurtling down. He must have gone about 40 feet, just kind of spinning on the end of the rope, roughly level with me. And his face was kind of contorted with rage that he'd fallen off. And then he said, "I've lost me bloody hat." And he had this cloth cap. And then the dreadful kind of realisation, me fags were in my hat. And also in his hat was all our money. And it was actually kind of going down like confetti, which worried me more. And anyway, I pulled him in, and I thought, well, this is my chance. I'm going to have a go at trying to climb this. And you've got to abandon the lovely safety of the chimney, and a couple of terrifying moves, and then the sense of absolute kind of euphoric elation that you'd done it, the most incredible pitch one had ever climbed. And I kind of screamed with joy, and then brought Don up, and then we dropped the rope down for Ian and Jean. And there was a French journalist there with a bottle of wine, and there were 4 young English climbers there. And one of those young climbers was young Doug Scott.
I found myself approaching the summit of Mont Blanc, and suddenly a helicopter arrived. And the guy jumps out and starts letting off purple flares. Oh, this is quite something. He hoped to announce the fact that the French had just climbed the Frenny Pillar. But as it turned out, who should come wading through the snow was Don, followed by Chris Bonington. Obviously the French and the Italians had got the Alps pretty well sewn up, so it was quite something for the Brits to be putting up a new route, especially one so celebrated as the Frenny Pillar. To suddenly snatch this plum was quite something.
I actually arrived, I think it was 10 days after my reporting date, at the Vandenberg's building. But they forgave me because I'd been so much in the news, both about from our ascent to the central pillar of Fresnay, and of course the fact that Don and I had gone back to the North Wall of the Eiger yet again, but had turned back. It was Vandenberg's who sell the margarine. My proper job was going to be being the Hampstead rep. There I was, reporting for duty in my dark suit. I very quickly began to wonder whether this is what I wanted to do all my life. It was at a 12th night party, early in 1962, that I actually met Wendy, girl in a little black dress. We started dancing together very late in the night, and it was an instant attraction. That night, went to bed that night together. I'd always wondered whether I'd ever find someone who was, felt absolutely right, and she did. We started living together almost immediately and got married 6 months later. My career with Vanderbergs went on, and I had a phone call one morning from Don saying, I've just been invited on an expedition mountain called the Central Tower of Patey. So I asked permission to go on another trip and said, this will really be the last time. And they sent me this excellent letter, really spelling it out, saying, look, you really need to make up your mind what you want to do with your life. Put as plainly as possible, the time has come for you to make up your mind whether you leave mountaineering or Vandenbergs. I agonised quite a bit. Wendy was absolutely, she had no hesitation at all. I think she was appalled at the thought of spending the rest of her life married to a business executive, and so I resigned. And that was in June. The expedition wasn't until October, so I thought, well, I'll have another summer in the Alps. Don, he picked me up on his motorbike, and we had the two of us on a Norton with a huge rucksack on my back, and drove the bike all the way out to the Alps. Back we went to the Eiger. I definitely experienced fear, real fear, the night before setting out. And I think more so than on any other climb I've been on. It was much too warm. You'd hear the stones rattling down, but we thought, well, at least we go and have a look. And so we went up onto the second ice field, and we're just about to turn back when these two Swiss guides came up and shouted up from below, two of your comrades are in trouble. Will you help us to rescue them? So we were just laboriously cutting steps right the way across the second ice field. And then we were about a third the way across, and suddenly there was this huge whooshing sound. And we saw this very small body whistling down the ice. Barry Brewster, he fell to his death. But that left Brian Lally. When we came up to him, he said, well, could I join you? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're going to the top, aren't you? I said, what the bloody hell do you think we're coming? We're coming to rescue you. You've just lost your mate. And he was just in that shocked kind of state. And then we put him in between us. And we went down into the arms of the Swiss guides, plus a huge number of journalists. The thing that I think Don and I found the most distasteful, though, was that kind of jackal quality that the media can have at times. And when we got down, we decided, no, we've had enough of the Eiger. If you're a climber and you're going to go on climbing at an extreme level and you want to go back to the Eiger, you have actually got to accept the fact that people die on it. And I think, therefore, I don't think you become hardened, but you've got to accept that as part of the game you play. It was coming towards the end of August, and Don was keen to get back. And Ian Clough, with whom, of course, we climbed the Central Pillar of Frenay, was there as well at a loose end. So the two of us decided we'd just grab one more climb, and we decided to go for the Walker Spur of the Grand Charras. We actually bivouacked on top of the Walker that night, and then the next day got to the Torino hut at about 11 o'clock that night, and very tired but hugely excited. I woke Ian up and said, look, Ian, I've had a brilliant idea. Let's go for the Eiger. And Ian kind of rolled over and said, F*** off. I'm serious, we really could do it. The north wall of the Eiger, if you climb it in perfect conditions, it's an unbelievably interesting, exciting route as it finds its way and up around all the problems. And there is this extraordinary kind of exhilaration you get from it. And I don't know whether it's all these endomorphines and everything else that rush up around and stimulate you, but it is very, very addictive. And that, I think, is that risk element that is the spice of climbing, and is actually the spice of adventure as well. It wasn't an anticlimax, but whereas all our experiences when we'd failed had been, or a lot of them had been very extreme, this hadn't been. We'd actually sold the story in advance to the Daily Express when we had absolutely no money at all. So we sold the story to them for £1,000. And then they spirited us away to keep us away from all the other papers. Took us to a hotel somewhere outside London until everything had died down and they'd milked the story to completion. Yeah, I did enjoy the fame and the fuss. I was commissioned to write a book. Really, it changed everything in my life. It's what really enabled me to follow the lifestyle and the career that I've led ever since.
The great thing about going on expeditions in the 1960s was that the cheapest way of getting an expedition to its objective was to take a long sea trip, and there was the days of ocean liners. So here we're sailing on the Reina del Mar, all the way across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, Panama Canal, all the way down to Valparaiso. And I'd made a little bit of money out of the Eiger climb, and therefore I said, well, I'll take Wendy with me as well. So she came with us to base camp. The picture that Don showed me of the Piney had this wonderful kind of granite tower. And so it was the combination of the unknown, the beauty of the mountain, the fact it was going to be really good climbing. It was so exciting. Don was, at the very height of his powers back in 1963. He was lean, hard, very, very tough. So it was really the weather that slowed us up and very nearly defeated us. And then, of course, we also had the bit of competition when the Italian expedition arrived, who actually had permission to climb the tower, whereas our permission wasn't really to climb the tower at all. It was a very general permission to explore the area. It's a perfect peak. Nothing in that area had been climbed. I've walked the block 1,000 times or more, and yeah, it's very special. I love its kind of very gentle beauty. It's not dramatic. Yeah, it's emotional, we've brought up our children here, and that's all the things you've been through. So yes, it's very dear to me.
There's no doubt about it that the solid home base based on a loving relationship is incredibly important. The worst memory of my life, I think of all, I think I've got to say it, is the loss of my first child. And that was little Conrad for certain. And I was in Ecuador at the time, and Wendy was staying with friends. They had a big garden, 5 children, and there was a stream at the bottom of the garden, and Conrad was a little adventurer. He was just coming up to 3. And he went wandering off, and he fell into the stream, and he was found later on, and he was dead. And that's something that you never, ever get over. And I got the news when I was in Ecuador, and obviously came rushing home and was heartbroken. Tom Patey, who was a very good deer climbing friend of mine, I think he saw when he phoned me up, only I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after I'd got back from Ecuador, he saw it as means of, do you think it'd help you? And I thought it would. One's first impression of Tom was he wasn't a sensitive man. He was a kind of a ball of fire. You never knew what you were going to do next with Tom. He had this black book in which he wrote all his planned climbs and said, look, I've got a fantastic project. It's called the Old Man of Hoy, just south of Orkney. And I kind of hummed and hawed a bit, and as Wendy said, look, go on, you must go. I think that undoubtedly was a catharsis. Got the train up and met up with Tom, and he'd already got another person involved, Rusty Baillie. It was formidable, no doubt about that whatsoever. You've got this horrendous kind of traverse below overhangs leading into this overhung kind of chimney come crack. We had big wooden wedges. And then Tom took the next pitch, which was the middle pitch, which is actually quite awkward and incredibly dirty. I got the best pitch of the lot, and the top pitch is magic. It looks incredibly impressive. It's a corner with the most fantastic holds all the way.
The first ascent of Hoy, the Old Man of Hoy, was probably one of the most adventurous first ascents in the British Isles. It must have been a major part of their lives at the time. And when the TV film came out, and a year later, refilming the first ascent, it certainly became public domain, really.
The tank landing craft eases her way into Scapa Flow. On board is £200,000 worth of television equipment. One mobile control room, one pantechnicon to carry the cables, one radio links van to bounce the pictures back to the mainland, and assorted other vehicles heading for the most outlandish outside broadcast spot ever imagined. 2 miles from the Old Man, a platoon of the Scots Guards sets up base camp.
There were 6 people who were going to take part in it. There was Joe Brown and Nina Davis, the founders of TV climbing. There was Tom and myself, and then they needed the new generation, and the 2 kind of young hotshots at that time was a guy called Peter Crewe, a very, very good rock climber, and Dougal Haston, who was emerging as the real power of climbing north of the border.
But even now, 50 years later or so, people refer to that TV epic of the Old Man of Hoy. It was the first of its type.
2 members of that pioneer party, Chris Bonington and Tom Patey, will attempt their original route.
And this is the hardest move on this pitch, I think. I've got to somehow turn round here, and I've only got a rather bad ham jam it right inside the crack.
Rusty Baillie with a beard who holds the radio camera, and behind them with the glasses, Ian Davis.
Ian, who to all of us, his friends, was Mac. We got to know each other back in 1960. He's one of my oldest friends.
Because the crack only takes these large cowbells.
I'm reading you loud and clear. This sounds a very harrowing night you had.
I was bitten by this bird, and I woke up and said, Joe, the birds are attacking us.
We take practically nothing in the way of bivouac equipment. We certainly don't take sleeping bags.
The thing, I think, been a focus for me of why I've climbed is actually the people with whom I've climbed.
I'm feeling rather like one of these American astronauts going into orbit. Well, here we go, way out into space.
And so it was just a very enjoyable, fun extravaganza.
It's a very funny position, is this? Your feet are on big holes.
Chris, we can see down onto you now.
It was delightfully relaxed. I knew I could climb it.
Chris Bonington? Can you hear me? Yes, very faintly.
7 million people watched it over 2 days, and it was probably the greatest TV spectacular in climbing that's ever been done. It's not so much an evolutionary form of challenge. It's actually each challenge you go for inevitably becomes greater. In the late 60s, the Himalayas were closed anyway because of political reasons. And so we were talking about going to the Himalayas when they opened up. And I think that exploration has become more and more important to me over the years. Annapurna, of course, is one of the 8,000 metre peaks. And the south face is actually towering above what's known as the sanctuary, something on a completely different scale. and nobody had climbed anything on the south side of Annapurna at the time. And the team I got together, it ended up with 8 climbers, all of whom were, amongst the best climbers in Britain at that time, with Don Willans as my deputy leader. And so it was in April of 1970 that we arrived at base camp.
Sorry, I've lost my laser pointer. What have I done with it? Sorry, hang on. I've got this, here's it in my other hand. Could we describe that as a senior moment?
Biggest expedition ever, the first I'd ever led. It was a huge logistic operation, just getting everything together.
The odd trekkers were arriving at base camp. And so whenever a trekker arrived, and they looked reasonably strong, we said, look, you can get an absolutely fantastic view from up there. And if you like, you can go up there. And they said, well, I'd love to do that. So would you mind carrying this as well? We give them 20 kilos of weight.
I'd always assumed that, we'd use fixed ropes. It would be a seed-style expedition. And of course, back in 1970, that was basically how all big Himalayan peaks were climbed, with a series of camps going up the mountain and fixing ropes where there were steep sections. Well, we knew that south face of Annapurna, you were going to have to fix ropes right the way up the mountain, just about. Once you get to the Himalayas, and particularly once one gets into these big seed-style expeditions, the problem is that you're actually exposed to objective danger over a much longer period of time, 4, 5, 6 weeks.
Would you think it worth the loss of life to get up this mountain? I mean...
No, I don't think any of us on this expedition would. I think if there was a casualty at all, it would be a question of withdrawing altogether.
Because we couldn't use Sherpas, because it was very, very steep, awkward kind of dewmarring to get up the fixed ropes, the climbers were actually going to have to both do the lead climbing and do the portering. And as you got higher, we ended up having 6 camps altogether. It got thinner and thinner.
Bonington worked hard to force the route across. The climbers called this section the Terrible Traverse.
You had very few rest days. I tried to alternate the climbers. For instance, there was Mick Burke and Tom Frost, who was an American climber, very talented American rock climber. Forced the Rock Band, which was about 2/3 of the way up the face, and had incredibly hard climbing. And it was Mick Burke that actually led what at that time was probably some of the hardest climbing that's been done at altitude.
The environment is hostile, in that really people shouldn't be there. You'll be climbing along and you'll think, oh God, I'm just absolutely knackered, I can't move up another foot. It's your brain that's tired. The brain's tiring underneath the mental strain of forcing upwards, of not knowing.
I do a lot of praying, sincerely I do. There's a lot of suffering, obviously, in a big mountain.
Progress was good. Burke and Frost had pushed halfway up the Rock Band in 5 days. The expedition was at 24,000 feet, but losing strength fast.
Getting the supplies flowing up as well, and it was like an incredibly rickety scaffolding that's about to fall apart at any moment. Towards the end of the expedition, there was me and Ian moved up to the Camp 5, just ferrying loads. And the rest of the team had just totally exhausted themselves. And I'd made sure that I had Dougal Haston and Don Willans, who were my strongest pair without a shadow of doubt. Finally, they made a push for the summit. And when they made that push, we still had 1,000 meters to go.
Willans and Haston were pushing up from 24,000 feet.
Dougal had done most of the pushing the route out, but on that last day, Don suddenly really came into his own, and he was out in front the whole way, and there was a real sting in the tail just to get to the top. It was an amazing effort.
The British Annapurna South Face expedition reached the summit.
The monsoon was upon us, And it was then just a matter of clearing the mountain. And the last two people on the mountain were Ian Clough and Mike Thompson. There was one dangerous bit, one serac wall, within minutes of safety.
Stop. The summit pair were Don Willen and Dougal Haston. Stop. Roger so far, over.
And as they were going under it, it collapsed. And Mike was in front, and he actually hurled himself into the base of the wall, and this huge serac avalanche tumbled over him. But Ian was a tiny bit back, and it just caught him full, and he was killed. We recovered his body, and we buried him below the mountain he'd done so much to help us climb. And it was, I still find it hard. You never get hardened to the loss of close friends, but he had done so much, and of course we had done so much together as well. And it was the first of many expeditions where we'd achieved success and then had the loss of someone right at the end of the expedition. Everest was on the horizon. That first half of the 70s was dominated by Everest. I was fascinated intellectually, by the whole business of planning and logistics. So the southwest face of Everest was something where you were trying to do something that seemed almost impossible. Not only your enemies, but also your friends said it was impossible. We were off to climb Changabang. There was Doug Scott, Martin Boyson, Dougal Haston and myself with a group of Indian climbers. And we got the news that a Canadian expedition had cancelled for the autumn of 1975. Everest had never been climbed in the post-monsoon season. No, I don't think any 8,000 metre peak had been climbed post-monsoon. Climbing in the autumn can become a kind of a battle of attrition, and you have a high casualty rate because it's so bitterly cold and exhausting.
You've got to have optimism, courage, if that's what it's called, drive, fitness, and be pretty sensible. But even with all those qualities and getting it all right, you're still on a knife edge.
There's no doubt about it that the Southwest Face was the biggest challenge of, if you like, modern Himalayan mountaineering, and the very fact that there'd been these 5 big expeditions, and all of them had been stopped by this feature of the rock band, which is a wall of rock that goes across the top of the Southwest Face at a height of over 8,000 metres. And no expedition had actually managed to get to the foot of the rock band in a fit state to really lay siege to it effectively.
It's always, when you've got to check up some of the old photographs, whether it's for a presentation you're doing, what have you, it always brings you back.
I think our very best friends, and including me, didn't give us more than about 50-50 chance of success. And most of the climbing world said, oh, you're wasting your bloody time. Why on earth spend all this money, all this effort on something that you're not going to do anyway? When they went into the pub and their peers would take the mickey off them and go, what on earth are you doing going on this big Bonington bonanza?
Well, gentlemen, welcome to the annual board meeting of British Everest Expedition Incorporated Limited.
So it was the biggest organisational, intellectual challenge of my life, without a shadow of doubt.
We established a Camp 5 up here, and this time we decided we'd go to the left-hand side, the way the Japanese had gone in 1970, and try to climb this gully here to make the bid for the summit. It was going to be Nick Escort and Paul Braithwaite. Nick, of course, had been on South Face of Annapurna. Paul, a newcomer to the expedition, a very, very good alpinist.
And much to my surprise, I was offered with Nick the first attempt at the rock band. That morning, I remember we were both really excited about it. As we got nearing the top of the fixed ropes, I looked up and there's a huge spindrift avalanche and I could feel the tension. I led off up some incredibly technical climbing.
It's just like a giant Scottish gully, and he went across and found another belay, and I went up.
Then the oxygen
ran out, ship.
And stuffed my bottle in the snow, and that was part of the belay, was an oxygen bottle in a steep gully snow. And it was Nick's lead. The first 30 foot or so were really bowled across this bulging wall. At the top of the ramp we could see the summit slopes. We were both out of oxygen at this point, I know that.
27,000 feet. That was going to burst, so I just got panicked.
Yeah, actually more.
Really,
27.5. You're
yeah.
still... you're like a sort of 105-year-old war veteran or something. But
everybody was delighted that we'd solved the main problems of the rock band. The game was on.
For the next phase of the climb, Bonington based himself at Camp 5. He had already decided that it was not the job of the leader to make the first summit assault.
And by this time I'd brought Doug Scott and Dougal Haston up to Camp 5. Doug and Dougal were some of the best climbers I think Britain's ever produced. But they were an incredible team together. They worked incredibly well together. Except for that little sighting of them at 4:30 in the evening, we didn't see anything at all.
It was now certain that the pair would have to spend the night on top of Everest. The chances of surviving without frostbite were remote.
Tomorrow could well possibly, rather than being a summit roll, could be a rescue one, because it's just possible they'll be in a very bad way when they come back. Is that understood? Over.
Kept our radio at Camp 2 open the whole time, and it was about 10 o'clock the following morning that suddenly it crackled into life.
Hello, Doug. It's great to hear you. Did you make it? Over. Wonderful, Doug. Congratulations from every single one of us.
Say on Everest, but it doesn't matter which mountain it is. Reaching that summit is the absolute focus. Dougal was an infuriating person in many ways to climb with. He never took a camera. Doug actually gave Dougal the camera and said, look, take a picture now so that my mum can see that I actually did get to the top. I realised that we actually had the logistics, not just to have a second ascent, but to have a third ascent. Well, I'd nominated Mick Burke, who was also the BBC cameraman, Martin Boyson, Peter Boardman, youngest member of the team, 25-year-old, and Patemba. And at that stage, I'd actually put myself into the third ascent. The weather had been slowly deteriorating, and it had turned from just being cloudy and windy into a full-blown Everest blizzard. So we down at Advanced Base Camp had the radio open the whole time, and it was Martin that opened it up and said, Pete's back. And just the way he said it, you knew something terrible had happened. I'll hand you over to Pete.
We both felt very pleased and happy to be up there, and after about half an hour we started off back down again, very confident that we were going to have a nice sort of leisurely safe descent. And all of a sudden we saw Mick. I hadn't expected Mick to have been going so strongly. We exchanged a few words. He wanted us to go back to the summit to film. We also wanted to conserve our energy for the way down. We said, well, no, we'll go on. He filmed us a bit. We said, you want to come? He said, oh, I'm near now, I'll go up. That was the summit, so.
And we'll wait for you anyway when we get down to the South Summit. Patemba's saying, look, Pete, I think we must go down, otherwise we're going to die. Pete just, you can't bring yourself to abandon a friend. He said, no, we'll wait a little. And at last he realised that if they didn't get down, they were going to die. And Mick never came down. Once again, at the end of a superbly successful expedition, we had to face a tragedy. His judgment, perhaps was loaded by his desperateness to get to the top, to get that film. It would have been so easy in that whiteout blizzard to actually go through the cornice. But, you know, he and I and all of us have been taking calculated risks, been pushing the odds and everything else in all our climbing careers.
The drive of the people involved wanted to push further and further naturally. And it is a numbers game, really, especially in the Himalaya. The risk became extremely high.
We're all responsible for the level of risk we actually want to take.
And you're there in a little group cocoon from the real world. The real world's gone, it's behind you somewhere. So you're with these people trying to climb this face, mountain, peak. And you're just totally involved with that scenario. And I fully expected on trips people to get killed, you know. The whole of mountaineering perspective had changed. The old fixed rope trips were a thing of the past, really. They played an important part in the role and the development of mountaineering.
If your expedition is big enough and well enough equipped and well enough planned, you can climb anything, almost. And therefore the challenge is actually to do it with less. Well, very shortly after we got back from Everest in '75, Doug invited me to join this expedition to the Oga, which was an unclimbed peak in the Karakoram Himalaya in Pakistan. And Doug wanted something that was in complete contrast to what the southwest face of Everest expedition would be, with its huge size, its hierarchic command structure and everything else.
6, 5, 4, 3.
Peak, very climbable, I would have thought, looking at it from a distance.
We are here to see the Mick Burke Award. The idea was that each expedition should aim to make a 20-minute film of their experiences.
But it would turn out to be the trip of a nightmare.
The winner will receive the Mick Burke Award. This trophy is a tribute to that talented and brave cameraman who lost his life in the successful assault on the southwest face of Everest. To make the presentation at the end of the programme, we are honoured to have with us His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales.
We were just 6 climbers. There was Mo Antoine, Clive Rowland, there was myself and Nick Escort who were going to climb together, and then there's Doug and Tup Braithwaite. It was absolutely minimalist.
Well, I know the consequences of that trip were, to put it mildly, very arduous indeed. Perhaps we'll hear a bit more about that after we've seen the film, filmed and commentated by Mo Antoine.
The sort of routine for the day is early away and early back off the hill. But one afternoon we were just sitting in the sun, enjoying ourselves, and there's this incredible noise, like an express train above us. And everybody started running around. Fortunately, I dived for the camera. And the climbing from the shoulder camp onwards, it suddenly became far more difficult than anything else we'd had on the route.
It was a block of granite, and it was incredibly compact rock.
We were let off by the ogre, and it was kind to us in the end, but it just showed us what a mountain can do if it does turn nasty. Because one minute the peak was all bliss and pleasant and nice climbing, and the next thing you really were fighting for your lives.
In fact, quite the hardest climbing I'd ever done at anything like that altitude, 23,000 feet.
It was 20 years and 20 attempts before a second summit ascent was made.
Primarily, most of it is absolute fun, and then you have those moments of of crisis and excitement. And there's no doubt about it that element of risk, that element of getting through a situation that could kill you, is also part of it.
We'd done it, we got to the top just as it was getting pitch dark. And Doug immediately, the moment I came up to him, he was setting up the ropes for us to start abseiling down. So Doug vanished, he must have stood on some ice, and off he went. And there was this colossal pendulum into a corner, and he used his legs as buffers. And then there was this horrendous scream from down below. And then this little voice came up. I've broken my bloody legs. And I was actually relieved. I thought, God, well, you know, could be worse. Just dug big bucket steps for him, had to crawl. I had a fall on the way down and broke my ribs, so I was in a bad way. It took us 6 days, 5 days without anything to eat. And I knew I had pneumonia, and I was coughing up blood and froth and everything else. And I knew that if we didn't get out soon, I'd probably die. And yet I just concentrated on staying alive.
But despite all the accidents and horrors and everything else, I mean, you'd still do it again, presumably, would you?
No, we're all going on another expedition this year.
Just after the Ogre that we started talking about going to K2. K2, of course, second highest mountain in the world, hadn't at that stage had a British ascent, but what we were interested in was doing a new route. We were quite a small team. There was, if you like, new blood. There was Joe Tasker, Peter Boreman, and then there was the old stagers, if you like, Doug Scott, Nick Escort, and Tuck Braithwaite. That was really the core of the hard climbers. We had a couple of Hunza high altitude porters as well. It was a much smaller expedition than Everest Southwest Face had been. We were going to get a line of fixed rope to a third or perhaps fourth camp and then go for the summit. We'd actually established the third camp. It was Peter Boreman, Joe Tasker, who were actually in that camp, and we were now just supplying them. And to get to that third camp, there was a huge snow basin, and it was Doug Scott, Nick Escort, that were carrying loads across.
And suddenly there was a tremor, went through the snow underneath me. By this time the adrenaline was surging through my body.
And the whole of that basin went. I mean, thousands upon thousands of tons of snow. And then that inkling of fear that maybe Doug and Nick had been involved in the avalanche.
Ice axe just ripped out the snow and I was cartwheeling and sliding uncontrollably down the slope, being not afraid, but very curious as to what it was going to be like in that avalanche and in fact, I suppose, what it would be like to die.
Nick was the person who was closest to me. I mean, he was one of the closest friends I ever had.
But he'd gone down some 5,000 foot of ice cliff and steep rock, yelling and yelling his name.
I went shooting straight back to England as quickly as possible, and I could sit down with Caroline and explain exactly what had happened. And of course, Nick was leaving 3 young children. I'll always have a feeling of guilt. I should have seen that it was potentially a windslap avalanche risk. It knocked everything out of me for a time. It was more a very big personal gap because we'd done so much together. Our children were around about the same age, they were going to the same primary school, so we were 2 very close families, as well as being 2 climbing friends.
I wasn't affected by it until we got back and saw Caroline and their family, you know, then you realise that this guy is dead. The risk is there and you all know it. You make your own decisions. I certainly took a rain check on my life and I, you know, made my mind up that the Himalayas were not the place for me.
It's never easier, but at the same time, I've never thought of actually giving up climbing. And I've never thought really of doing anything less dangerous, less difficult.
Public think he's just a big expedition man or expedition leader. He's a great climber in his own right, Chris, and did some phenomenal climbing after K2. He sort of went off doing smaller trips with friends and very successful trips.
Conga. And once again, the original film. Really is a treasure, certainly memories. I was climbing with a younger generation then. Peter Boardman, Joe Tasker, and then Al Rouse.
We were making the ascent alpine style, which means not using porters, not establishing camps, or using fixed ropes. I started getting really tired, and I kind of staggered up and a last kind of steep little slope and kind of collapsed like a floundering whale and said, I can't go on any further.
Just because he'd had pneumonia and because he's 46, felt entitled to announce that he was knackered frequently and needed a rest. Well, really I did as well, but I didn't have to say it. I could just sit down every time he sat down and get a rest as well.
And then as we got to the summit, we lined up, the three of us, and then Joe was absolutely determined to be in the picture as well himself.
I thought it's a bit daft if there's only 3 people seen in the summit, so I then rushed into the picture and stood there so that I was in the summit photo too.
The times for change had arrived, really. The transition period had passed through. It's a natural progression of young mountaineers coming in with different styles, lightweight styles. People had changed, people had moved on.
I think that was the time that Chris began to realise his age, or began to realise how incredibly fast Pete and Joe were. It was a time when he started, instead of wanting to lead expeditions from the front, tended to go back a little bit.
We went back to Everest, the north side, in 1982, just as 4 climbers. We discovered that, in fact, it was too few. We were going for the unclimbed part of the northeast ridge of Everest, and it's a huge, long ridge. It had been attempted once, I think, at that stage, and we were going to do it with no support of any kind, no porters, no oxygen. It was bitterly cold. Though we had tents with us, we found that it was so viciously windy you had to use snow holes.
Once inside the snow cave, we could relax and recover in preparation for the next section of the ridge above us.
It was very, very committing. We were pushing the route out still further.
You're sitting on the ridge, are you? Over?
Dick Renshaw had a stroke, suddenly couldn't use his left arm and walk properly, which was due to brain edema, swelling of the brain.
So we then all retreated all the way back to Advanced Base Camp, and we had to send Dick back to Lhasa.
I think we probably alternated at that time, thinking, oh God, thank God we can go home now, and get out of this hellhole. And then, when you'd rested a bit, want to get back there.
Although passing blood and suffering stomach pains, Joe Tasker was determined to join Pete Boardman in one last push for the summit.
I think perhaps all of us were beginning to wonder whether we'd taken a bit too much on. I was knackered. I mean, I was that much older than they were, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it. But I was 100% with them. They were capable of doing it. It was the 17th of May, 1982, and we saw them going up beyond our high point, which was well over 8,000 metres, and then climbing over what we call the first pinnacle, and then there was a rocky tower, and they disappeared behind that. And the last we saw of them was at 9 o'clock that night in the gathering dark, and we saw this tiny little figure. We should have had a radio call that day, but we never got one. And then, of course, they didn't appear. Second day, third day, and by the third day, one realised that something must have gone desperately wrong. There's no way they could be alive. It was only 10 years later that Pete's body was found by a Kazakh expedition. What had happened, I don't know. But what I can't help thinking, you see Pete lying there as if he'd just fallen to sleep, and there's a load of rope vanishing into the snow. And maybe Joe had been in trouble. Pete, after what had happened on the 75 trip and having to leave Mick, I don't think Pete would have ever left Joe. But who knows? But I think that's the feeling. But it was. For me, it's still devastating. Always has been.
You get into a different mindset that's, I think, comparable to being at war. You know, I felt that we'd been on a bombing raid and somebody hadn't come back.
It was a time when the climbing community was hit by so many of its most outstanding personalities being killed over a comparatively short period of time. Losing Pete and Joe and the way they were lost was heart-rending. But it was the very following year, almost kind of to find some kind of catharsis, that I went off with Jim Fotheringham to climb Shifling and had the greatest climbing experience I've ever had.
When it comes to the big mountains, when everything's starting to go a little wrong, Chris's enthusiasm, albeit sometimes unrealistic, is enough to actually sort of pull the big effort out, actually.
It was the best climb I've ever done. It was a pure alpine-style route. Well, 5 days up, 1 day down the other side. Quite necky, quite exciting. It was one of the great experiences of our lives. So it was getting into where I was just climbing purely for the enjoyment and not for a driving ambition. A Norwegian guy called Arne Næss. He was planning the first ever Norwegian Everest expedition, and I gave him what advice I could, and we struck up a friendship and went climbing together quite a bit. And then in 1982, when I was about to go on the northeast ridge of Everest, Arne said, well, look, just in case you don't get up, I've got my permission in 1985, you're very welcome to come with us. I actually told Wendy, I wouldn't say I promised, but I told Wendy, so look, I'm never ever going back to Everest again. And when Arne contacted me, and I told him, I said, no, look, I'm not going back to Everest again. I couldn't do it. And Arne was very clever, and he said, well, do you mind if I ask your advice every now and then? And he kept phoning me up and asking me about things, and it just, I just couldn't resist it. And I said, look, can I change my mind? And he said, I was waiting for that. And then I hadn't got the guts to tell Wendy. And so I didn't tell her for another week or so, but I was now committed to the expedition. And it was inevitable that Wendy came into the office one day and I was deep in conversation about logistics and everything. And I mean, she was really fed up, not because I'd gone back to Everest, because she thought I would, but the fact that I hadn't discussed it with her. She forgave me and she was 100% behind me. We were going for the South Col route, a reasonable chance of getting to the top of the mountain. And we were the last expedition that had the mountain to ourselves. And after that, the Nepalese government threw it open to everyone. So we were the only expedition on the South Col. I actually began to wonder whether I had the strength to make it those last few hundred feet to the top. It was actually going onto the Hillary step, and I was at the back at that stage and struggling a bit. I had Doug Scott, and Doug, absolutely realistic, was floating in the air by my right shoulder, and he was just quietly talking me up it, and then he vanished. I know it was something that my mind had created. I just couldn't stop thinking of all those friends who'd lost their lives, and got to the top. And I'm an emotional soul anyway, but I just cried my bloody eyes out. And then slowly became aware of where I was, and it was a absolutely perfect day. Then I felt, God, I've made it. Thank God I've got that out of my system. It was definitely the end of one era of my climbing life. And I think after Everest, it was actually just climbing for the sheer joy of climbing, but that joy is encompassed in of going to places where people haven't been before, of actually looking at a mountain, whether it's on a photograph initially, very often, and saying, oh, could I climb that? And then climbing it with your mates.
You can't imagine that there'd be an expedition, successful or unsuccessful, tragedy or no tragedy, and Chris would say, well, that's it, I'm now going to prune the roses for the rest of my life. That's not him.
There are still thousands of wonderful unclimbed lines in the Himalayas and in the further ranges just waiting to be climbed. If you're asked about a legacy, for instance, of what you've done, of all the climbs I've done in the greater ranges, Everest is the only climb that wasn't a new route. And everything else has either been first ascent of a peak or a new route up a peak that's already been climbed. My life ambition now is to keep going as well as I can and enjoy life to the full into my 90s. And whether I manage it or not is quite another matter, but I'm going to do my damnedest to do it. The spirit of adventure in the individual will always continue to blossom and will always continue to develop, whether it's at sea, whether it's crossing the poles, whether it's climbing. I think adventure will always come out in the end. I think it's incredibly difficult to justify the drive that we as extreme climbers have. It sounds selfish, but I think the adventurer puts to the back of his mind his family. We were incredibly lucky. We had 2 smashing boys. I talked about it with Wendy, for instance, and she accepted totally that if I really wanted to do something, she was 100% behind me. But if the moment I expressed doubts, she was very concerned.
How did it feel seeing the old man for the...
I felt it was a shock. I mean, I think I felt apprehensive anyway, and not just being 80, but I mean...
It's been a tough summer, hasn't it?
But no, also my wife's been desperately ill and of course sadly died very recently. During that period I haven't climbed. She had motor neuron disease, and it's a cruel disease that leads eventually to complete paralysis. And there were, well, the most intense, painful 18 months of my life. It's a big challenge, facing life like this by yourself, but it's something you've got to deal with and you've got to cope with. And I felt that going and doing the Oman of Hawaii would be a good thing to do. But when I looked at it, and I was wet and I was cold and frightened and worried, you know, and wondering, can I do it? And am I going to make a total fool of myself? You suddenly realise that your time on this earth is finite. Your time of physical activity is finite.
Okay. Just enjoy it, eh?
Have fun.
Yeah, you too, sir.
Creak up, slowly but surely. I love the actual sensation of climbing. With me, as you get into your 60s, you start stiffening up a bit. As you get into your 70s, you stiffen up a lot, and the standard of climbing, it drops. You know, you're climbing much easier stuff. And whereas when you were climbing at the height of your powers, you were drifting up a climb, however hard it was. Now, as you get older, you lose that, and you're losing a very important part. And these days, I creak up climbs, so you've lost that kind of sensual delight. I think I've always climbed for the passion. And in my earlier years, it was a passion for stretching to the absolute limit.
The trouble is, bridging hurts so much. Ugh.
The friendships we make when we go adventuring, you know, whether it's by sea, by air, by mountains, or whatever it happens to be, there's a special dimension to that friendship. And I think the older you get, the terrifying thing is you have fewer and fewer friends who actually are left.
I remember just going up it, whooping with joy, you know. I can't be grunting up it this time.
Each generation is always going to be able to find a way of surpassing or doing something different from the previous generation. And I don't think there's any bound, any limitation to what the human being can do.
Yes, you start looking further afield and you start realising, yes, A, you're lonely, but B, you want other relationships. Mac was married to Loretto and had a long, happy marriage with her. And then sadly, Mac got Alzheimer's. So Loretto had nursed Mac for all that time. Of course, an intense, hard period, doing everything I could to support Wendy. They died within a few months of each other. She's an incredibly beautiful woman, and she's lively, vivacious, very, very sociable. And I was a little frightened of her.
I have actually found someone who I can have a new and a fresh, loving relationship with that in no way replaces the past, but takes us into the future.